Well, do a web search sometime on the phrase true self or finding your true self. And what you will see are lots of articles with the word myth in the title. No, the search results are not lots of myths about people finding their true selves. Rather, the results are about how the true self is a myth. It's clear from a scientific viewpoint that there is no such thing as a true self. Yet, in our folk psychology, the self looms large, especially the true one, whatever that is. So I have to conclude that though the true self is indeed a myth, it's a myth that adds something to our lives when we think about it. So what is that value added? Isn't it interesting, after all, that folk psychology tends to point to a person's true self as good, ignoring the possibility that the true self actually might be, evil or something. For example, when someone's addicted to drugs and they begin to fight that addiction, we say that that person is returning to their true self. We don't tend to consider the opposite, that when someone's using drugs heavily, they are expressing their true selves at that point. So notice the difference here. It's a folk psychology thing. The true self is a moral self, we somehow believe. It's a healthy self, it's a striving self, and it's a communally agreeable kind of self. In addition, studies indicate that our folk psychology also teaches us that everyone has that moral core of goodness. Those we know, those we don't know, and those in our group and those who are not in our group. We're very nice about people's true selves. They must be good inside. So it appears that even though the true self is a fiction, well, somehow assuming that fiction is true, it appears to be a good thing. After all, very few of us want to agree with the British curmudgeon Quentin Crisp when he says, if at first you don't succeed, failure may be your style. Don't we hear that as somehow cynically humorous? Yet we know instinctively that such a sentiment is physically and psychologically dangerous for someone to have. Rather than accepting failure, we want for ourselves and others that striving to go on, let's go after that true self, that good one. That's what I want to consider today, is that myth of the true self and how we can use that to frame, maybe getting towards some kind of center and think about how we go about doing that. After all, it's a new year, and many among us are thinking of those New Year resolutions and those setting of intentions. And before we make resolutions, maybe we need to think a bit about what it is we're resolving to do. So part of our cultural compulsion here to find our true selves comes from that book that I mentioned last week, the week before, so few people actually read. The verse is from the Gospel according to Mark 8:36. It's often printed in red letters as the actual words of Jesus. In the King James translation, it goes like this: "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Now, this is the version that I learned in Sunday school as a kid, and the sentiment has gotten lots of traction over time in our culture itself. It's a way of saying that, these earthly goods are worthless in face of eternity, right? So, and often we condemn the rich, perhaps, for that, and it's become part of the Christian message. But is that what the words are actually saying? Well, that's a different matter. The Greek word often translated into English as soul is psyche. And that's where we get the word psyche in English, for as in psychology. But in Greek, it meant breath, not psyche as something in the mind. It meant breath. So another way of translating that Greek would be, for what shall it profit an anthropon? That's also where we get anthropology, right? What does it profit a person, right, if they shall gain the whole world and lose their own breath? Does that mean life? It's a little more problematic than it first appears. Often psyche is translated as life, but if that's the proper translation, then what does the saying mean? Is the idea that gaining the whole world is a waste of your breath, is a waste of your life. Maybe that's what it means. What does the sentence actually mean? It's mysterious. Yet, as with so many other mistranslated sentiments, this one is part of our cultural understanding. Soul, spirit, psyche, life force. The sentence is saying that something is more important than gaining earthly goods, somehow. As we say in the South, a hearse ain't got no trailer hitch. You can't take it with you when you go. You will not be exiting with your U-Haul, towing behind. We want to have, or I guess, some of us, we want to have had a moral core during our life, right? A center that was in some way good. We want people to say after we're gone, that was a good person, all right? Whatever that means. In his 1869 book, Culture and Anarchy, the British writer and poet Matthew Arnold expressed his fear that his contemporary capitalist society, we're talking 1869 here, his contemporary capitalist society was on the positive side capable of creating infinite commodities, as he called them. But in the minus column, that great capitalist society was creating incomplete and mutilated human beings, he called us. Incomplete and mutilated, stunted and enfeebled, as Matthew Arnold saw it. Now, many thinkers and artists in the 19th century realized that the church was on the wane, especially in Great Britain. Often, it was not the decline of religion or the death of God, as it was often called, that was really bothering people of that time, especially cultural critics such as Matthew Arnold. He was already an atheist. That's not what was bothering him about what he saw as the collapse of the church in Europe. His question was, where would the art reside after the churches closed? Where would people find art? Because, you see, in Christendom, the Europe of the time, that's where you went to see art. That's where you went to hear art. That's where art was. If people stopped going to church, where would they go? Were Europeans doomed to incomplete and mutilated, stunted and enfeebled existences as they drowned in their endless, infinite capitalist commodities? Isn't our focus nearly always on the socioeconomic, after all? In our lives. What do we hear? We hear how Wall Street is doing. What the cultural critics of the 19th century didn't see coming was that art would become a secularized form. It would come out in visual, cheap reproductions of paintings, cheap books printed by the thousands. It would go into museums that began to open and open and open, concert halls, and et cetera, et cetera. They hadn't seen these in the early 19th century, but they begin to crop up as the century goes on. No, art no longer exists as a captive of the churches. They just didn't see how that was going to change, but we can see it nowadays. Interestingly enough, that thing that we somehow know that, you're not supposed to sell your soul, center, etc., for those infinite commodities, that soul or center or that essence we still think of somehow in the spiritual religious viewpoint, even though art has now become secular. What was going to be missing if churches closed down, they were wondering. The 19th century artists and critics ask, where will the poetry live? Where will the art be? And how will we avoid this infinite commodity that will kill our soul? Now, all these years later, we have this thing that nowadays we're calling spiritual but not religious. And that didn't come from nowhere. That seed was planted, I think, in the 19th century. It's the folk wisdom answer to that either-or thinking of, is it religion or science? Got to be one or the other. No, it doesn't have to be that one way or the other, and I think most people have kind of figured that out. As I see it, spiritual but not religious is a shot at a both-and kind of expression, science and art, science and religion. We're not going to exclude either of those, and if our church systems say we've got to, we're going to leave and go be spiritual but not religious. The dialectic itself is what is being mistrusted. This either-or kind of thinking, I think. Why would we compare and contrast science and the arts, or science and religions? The spiritual but not religious folks are asking that question. Spiritual but not religious looks at both the Nobel Prize laureate scientist, smart person, I think I'll listen, and the Pope in Rome, smart, yeah, maybe I'll listen, but neither of them are the boss of me. I will make my own spiritual decisions. And that's kind of Protestantism in a nutshell. It's what Protestants have been doing since way back in the Reformation period. The logic of Protestantism is schism and splintering. That's what Protestants do. We splinter, we schism, we doubt, we say that can't be right, and it's a destructive acid that just keeps eating away, eating away, eating away, until eventually you get to humanism. Now, some cultural critics are even wondering if the idea of a true self may be one of the targets of the spiritual but not religious people today. It's not part of this religious ethos that is developing. Many people are discovering in our information-saturated reality not a true self, not a true center, but a fluid identity narrative. This is the new catchphrase, a fluid identity narrative. I change all the time according to what I'm seeing and what I'm watching. In one instance, an authority will be a scientist. In the next instance, it's a magician or a shaman or something like that. These are different categories of expertise, yet more and more contemporary people are saying one doesn't preclude the other. I got room for all of that stuff. This acceptance of categories, while dismissing the relevance of categories, appears to me to be the future of that, what we're going to call spiritual but not religious. I will dismiss all categories in my own way of thinking, people are saying. Now, this week's news cycle was filled with that very odd story of a politician who appears to have created his own backstory. Now, the question that occurs to most commentators that I've read about is, who is he really? But I don't care who he really is, frankly. I'm not interested in the guy. But I am interested in the question of, is it because he lives within this idea of a fluid identity narrative? Is he simply living multiple fictions in his own mind? We construct a self that makes sense of the events that have happened to us during our lives. We sit down and we say, okay, that was a high point, and that followed in the plot, and man, was I brilliant when I did that, and that was stupid. And we create the story around, a narrative around ourselves, the good, the bad, and the forgettable. But a self is first and foremost a product of the need for coherence. We need to figure out a story in our lives, right? That's how we find our own center. We don't want to live in these nested bowls of lies, lies, and lies. That does exactly the opposite of what finding your center does. Suddenly, you're just kind of all over the place. Now, in a New York Times op-ed, the columnist, many of you know, I like David Brooks a lot of the time and sometimes can't stand the guy, but he has this to say about it. I wonder if the era of the short attention spans and the online avatars is creating a new character type. The person who doesn't experience life as an accumulation over decades, but just as a series of disjointed performances in the here and now with an echo of hollowness inside. I think that's a good question to be asking. No, I don't want to be, pretend to be a psychologist here. I'm not one, and I don't play one behind pulpits. But somehow, something happened to this human being that he thought he could create his own narrative, and apparently that no one would notice or question in our new world of anti-facts. It's a new cultural formation, I believe, and I'm not one of these old curmudgeons who's going to say, well, all young people are troubled these days because they watch too much TV or whatever. No, that's not it. There is some kind of cultural fluidity, a narrative fluidity that is taking over my mind, too. I disagree with David Brooks. It isn't the fluidity that is the danger here, I think, but rather the container, if we can do metaphor here, the container of the fluidity. What is channeling the fluidity and where is it going, I think is a good metaphor to look at. Will fluid identity narratives flow in a channel that is good, or can it be put into a channel that is good? This we don't know. But I think we need to think about trying to get that compared with the centering in this idea of a true self. My hunch is that the fluidity of identity will increase over time. Necessarily so. That's not the question or the challenge. That's just a given, I think. The challenge is how people who wish to lead virtuous lives are going to deal with that fluidity and not simply lose the center of ourselves. The question is first about self-honesty in that case, in the face of fluid identity narratives, and only secondarily is the question about some kind of lying in public or something of that sort. Now, I do also want to consider one other cultural trend that I think is going in this direction. One of the candidates for the new word of the year for 2022 is perma-stressed. Perma-stressed. It didn't win number one, but perma-stressed. In October of 2022, the American Psychological Association did a survey that indicates the percentage of U.S. adults who are so stressed out most days that they cannot function in a normal way. The results, I think, are telling. And they correlate also with generational data, as you quickly notice. Gen Xers, boomers, and older, we're not all that stressed. We're not perma-stressed anyhow, but people below the age of 44, millennials, Gen Zs, etc., more than 1/3, nearly half, report being so stressed most days that they cannot function. What's going on here? We know that there are lots of factors involved, yet I have to ask, is there a correlation between that perceived fluidity that I was just thinking about and this inability to overcome or to control stress, this perma-stress? And if these are connected, what can we do about it? And I guess the answer is find a center and find a way to get back to your center even when you are extremely perma-stressed. How do you get back to yourself? Well, I have a suggestion. Joanne Rogers, that's the wife of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. They were married for 51 years. She says, no one worked harder at being Fred Rogers than Fred Rogers himself. No one worked harder at being Fred Rogers than Fred Rogers himself. Now, we could be old-fashioned about that and say that Fred Rogers found his true self in some way, and he wasn't born with a sweater, but he got into one as quickly as he could. But as Joanne Rogers underlines, Fred Rogers had to work hard at being Fred Rogers. He found a center, he found his core values, but in order to remain Mr. Rogers in this reality of fluid identities that we all live in, Fred Rogers had to recenter himself and get up in the morning and recenter himself again. He had to work hard at making it look so easy to be Fred Rogers. What's known popularly as finding yourself can be extremely individualistic and solitary, or it can be about centering yourself while realizing that none of us is the center of anything. I think that's what Fred Rogers figured out. It's a way of thinking, and when we realize we're not the center of the universe, we wake up to compassion for others, the earth, and the living things. It's the truth of our center and our core and our meaning and purpose that we are looking for. So, my conclusion for this year, I will set some intentions. I don't do resolutions anymore. Why feel bad about myself in 6 months, right? But set an intention anyway. And the questions that I want to ask is to focus me, anyway, in this fluidity that necessarily jumping from CNN to Twitter to Facebook is going to do to us. And the first question I want to ask myself, and I suggest you think about it, is what am I meant to be? What am I even meant to be? And then, what do I mean to be? What do I mean to be? Questions to ask ourselves in this new fluid reality. So may it be.